Hello, friends. Patrick McFarlane here of the Liberty Weekly podcast. Welcome back. This one is episode 103, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/103. This weekend, I am running an interview that Keith Knight did with the famous Scott Horton of The Scott Horton Show and of the libertarianinstitute.org. They discussed American imperialism, as you will soon find out. I'd just like to say that we will be releasing a new show in the next few days here, but this one was too good to not run. It is a little bit long, so hang in there, but it is definitely worth it. So without further ado, this is Keith Knight and Scott Horton.
Hello, welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. I want to start off with a question. When do you think it's okay for another country to bomb and or invade America? When discussing things like foreign policy, it's important to recognize these things because instead of arguing whether or not Saddam had WMDs, even if he did, would carpet bombing the place, would sanctions still be justified? After Waco, would someone be justified in bombing America? Well, that's what the excuse was after Assad committed atrocities against his citizens. So thinking consistently is important. Today we have the author of this terrific book, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan with Scott Horton. You can visit him at scotthorton.com. He's the host of The Scott Horton Show, has over 4,500 interviews. Scott, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Scott, who was responsible for the 9/11 attacks and what was their motive?
Well, I think it really was Al-Qaeda that did it. That doesn't mean every detail of the commission report or that kind of thing is true. In fact, I never even read the commission report. I think there's plenty of great journalism that points to those guys. In fact, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin al-Shibh bragged to Al Jazeera reporter in Pakistan in 2002 that, yes, they had done it. And I think it's pretty credible if you look at Ali Soufan and all that, explaining how really the Cole plot was half of the 9/11 plot, that it had all been dreamt up at this Malaysia meeting or agreed upon at the Malaysia meeting, et cetera, like this. So it was the bin Ladenites that did it. And the motive was the motive, first of all, was American intervention in the Middle East. The strategy that they were employing was to provoke an American overreaction. Because the way that they looked at it was they wanted local revolutions in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, and across the Middle East, but that they could never get away with that as long as the American superpower and empire is the dominant force in the region. And they figured they could never get us to leave unless they could bog us down, bleed us to bankruptcy, and force us out the hard way, the same way the U.S. helped them do to the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And of course, our economy is a little bit more robust than the USSR's communist one of that time. But that intervention truly did help to bring down the Soviet Union. It was one of the final straws that broke the back of that system. And so these guys learned the lesson that, hey, let's do that again to the Americans. And they actually warned Eric Margolyes as early as 1986. When we're done with these Russians, you're next. And for the very same reason, they saw us as mirror images of each other, attempting to dominate their countries, their part of the world, and they weren't having it. And so what they wanted to do was get America to overreact, to do actually exactly what America has done, which is destabilize the region, overthrow enemy governments, all of which have been secular fascist type governments, Iraq, Libya, and half a regime change in Syria so far. And of course, in Yemen and all this, all the war and chaos that we've done has led to, really, it was Jeff Huber who wrote an article right when America was launching the war against Libya in 2011. Huber wrote, Osama bin Laden, dead and loving it. And he says, eat your heart out, Charlemagne. And joke's on you, Alexander. It turns out that this one dead guy who had spent the last decade hiding in the attic is the most powerful military commander in history. And he can order hither and yon the greatest army that's ever existed all over the planet to accomplish its bidding. And he's talking about the U.S. Army. So in that sense, you could, is sort of a worn out joke by now. You could really be a reverse 9/11 truther and say that, no, it's Bush and Cheney and Obama and Trump and James Mattis and their colleagues are the ones who've been serving Al-Qaeda all this time, carrying out exactly what they wanted to happen, for America to turn the region upside down. So Osama never got to be the king of Saudi. But other than that, we've accomplished quite a bit of their agenda.
One of the best cases for blowback is in this book, chapter 1, Getting into the Mess. You quote George W. Bush twice, once in 2000, the next in 2001. In 2000, George W. Bush said, if we don't stop extending our troops all around the world in nation-building missions, then we're going to have a serious problem coming down the road, something Ron Paul warned about after Bill Clinton bombed a pharmaceutical company in Sudan. In 2001, September 20th, President Bush said they hate us for our freedoms. Scott, is it because they hate us for our freedoms, who we are, the fact that our girls go to school, as Marco Rubio says, or is this a case of blowback? What's your reasoning?
Well, that's the whole thing about it is, the American imperial domination, or, I don't know, regional hegemony. If you're a think tanker, if the word imperialism hurts your feelings, America's doctrine of dominance in the Middle East begins far before the terrorist war against the United States. So if you want to say that, well, they hate us because we're free, then it doesn't seem to me like it's fair, or because, their religion makes them hate us because we're free, is really, to paraphrase it more accurately, the way that they say. You would have to first dismiss the violence. Look, we know it's not the sanctions and the blockades and the bombings and the support for dictatorships and the torture and the regime change. We know it's not the wars. We know it's not the violence. They love it when you blow up their cousin. That's not it. Now that we've successfully dismissed that, all that's left by process of elimination, it must be their horrible, crazy, backwards, violent, radical religion that makes them hate virtue. But I mean, come on, how self-serving and ridiculous is that? As though we don't remember that there was a 20th century, as though history began on September 11th. Just think about how much we all hate Bill Clinton. Well, why do you think foreigners would hate Bill Clinton less than us? We hate him because he bombed Waco. He used the Army Delta Force to bomb Waco. Well, guess what? They hate him because he used the Army Delta Force to bomb them too. More, often he used the U.S. Air Force. But still, Bill Clinton was killing people for 8 years straight. That wasn't peacetime. So, and I've never heard anyone say, listen, when Osama bin Laden told his followers the reason we're going to war against America is because they have bases in Saudi Arabia that they're using to bomb Iraq, and they're supporting Israel in their wars against the Palestinians and against the Lebanese. And they're supporting our tortured dictatorships that murder us and kill us. And they're fixing the oil price so low to subsidize their economy at our expense. And we get none of the money, even though it's all of our resources. And on and on and on. That he's a liar. He doesn't care about that. He never meant any of that. And in fact, never mind whether he meant it at all. He only ever cynically pretended to think that this mattered, when in fact, this was his recruitment propaganda, because this is what worked. This is clearly the motive, and this is clearly the motive of the people who join him. And I talk about in the book how after the Israeli Grapes of Wrath adventure, I hate to use that euphemism, their aggressive operation in southern Lebanon in 1996, they bombed a UN shelter full of women and children at a small village called Qana, in what's now called the first Qana massacre, because they did it again in 2006. But anyway, back in 1996, this was a big part of Osama bin Laden's propaganda. And in the book Perfect Soldiers, Terry McDermott talks about the Hamburg cell of the core of the pilots. Ramzi bin al-Shibh was the helper, but Mohammed Atta and a couple of these other guys who had become the pilots in the September 11th attack, that this was the final straw. Mohammed Atta, first of all, they would all sit around all day blaming America and saying Americans had to die because of what Israel was doing in Lebanon and in Palestine. That was an ongoing theme, which I think in 1996, most Americans would not be able to understand what's the correlation at all. What what does America have to do with what Israel's doing in Lebanon? They don't know. They would have been totally shocked by that. But then during Grapes of Wrath, in that particular operation, Muhammad Atta filled out his last will and testament, which was, metaphorically, he was joining the army against the United States. That was his September 11th that made him join up to fight us. And then when they heard bin Laden's propaganda, that was all about the Americans must pay because of what Israel's doing in Lebanon, citing specifically the Qana massacre. Then the next year, Muhammad Atta and Ramzi bin al-Shibh traveled to Afghanistan to join bin Laden. And these were the ringleaders of the plot, including the pilot of Flight 11.
Osama bin Laden's son, Omar, gave an interview to Rolling Stone magazine, which you quote on page 46 of your book. What is the significance of that interview? Why is it important?
Yeah. Okay. So it's 2010, and this is one of bin Laden's non-terrorist sons. I'm not sure how many different sons he had. One of them is actually, an Al-Qaeda terrorist leader now, supposedly, anyway. But this is one who's not. And he was interviewed in a nightclub with his girlfriend in Damascus by Rolling Stone. And they talked to him for a long time. And he had said he had basically broken up with his father and said, I'm getting the hell out of here in the summer of 2001. And he said, I don't want anything to do with this anymore in the lead up to September 11th. And what he says, and this has to be right, this isn't a put on. He says, my father's dream was to lure America into Afghanistan. And then it rings a little naive the way he says, Bill Clinton was so smart. All he ever did was send cruise missiles and didn't overreact the way my father wanted him to. But he says that Osama was rooting for Bush in the Bush versus Gore election because he could just see mark all over this guy's forehead. That here's a guy who wants to be, a pretend tough guy and have violent conflicts that he can be the commander of and make all his corporate friends rich on contracts and all these things. It was written all over his face. He was going to prove he was tougher than his father in Iraq and all of these things. And so bin Laden was rooting for him to win. And as his son says, he was excited and grateful when the Supreme Court gave it to Bush Jr. and he became the president. And because he knew, as his son puts it, he knew that here is a president who will invade and come and spend and break the country, meaning break the treasury, run up the debt beyond our ability to pay. And this sort of thing was the plan all along. And because Afghanistan is ungovernable, unconquerable land, it's the size of Texas. It's landlocked. It has an entire, I guess the width of Pakistan between it and the sea, and it's all mountainous terrain. So our convoys have to go all the way up to the Khyber Pass in, halfway up the country, hundreds of miles into Pakistan to even get across the border into the place. And then it's all mountains like Colorado and deserts like California. And it's all badlands. And therefore, the tribal society that has grown up there over the last few thousand years are full of a bunch of hardened fighters. And they always have been. It's a traditional warrior culture. And at the core of their culture is that they will never give in to foreign domination, and particularly the Pashtun tribes there. That's what they're all about. And they'll tell you that. Any more than Texans would give in to an invasion, or the men of Colorado now would give in. We've all seen Red Dawn, and you know exactly what would happen. Our guys with our rifles would be sniping from the mountaintops down at whoever the invaders were until they were finally all gone. One way or the other, we'd win out no matter what. Right. And so that's basically, I guess I'm jumping around and jumping ahead there, but this was the motive, was at the expense of the people of Afghanistan. He said, let's replicate what the Soviet Union did here. Let's bog America down in Afghanistan until they break the same way we did the Russians. Well, when the Russians came, they killed 1 million people. When the Russians came, they devastated Afghanistan. And bin Laden's idea was, oh, well, who cares, right? As long as you're serving Allah and the greater good and whatever, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. And so it was his decision then to sacrifice the people of Afghanistan for his greater ambition of wrecking the American empire.
correct me if I have these organizations or these dates wrong, but if bin Laden made his first declaration of war against the U.S. in 1996, how did ABC and CNN get an interview with him in 1997 and 1998? Doesn't this qualify him for a CIA hit list? The mainstream media can find him, but CIA and MI6 can't?
Yeah, well, I mean, I hate to criticize you, but you're begging the question a little bit that CIA can't. CIA presented Bill Clinton with at least 10, and according to one U.S. Senate report, 13 different chances to kill Osama bin Laden, but they wouldn't take it. And I highly suggest that people look at those interviews with bin Laden from 96 and 97. John Miller at ABC, Peter Bergen and Peter Arnett at CNN, and read those and what's going on in those interviews. I mean, it's absolutely an education to do so. But if you listen to Michael Scheuer, he's to this day got steam coming out his ears over, you want to talk about killing bin Laden. We told Bill Clinton over and over again, here's how to kill him. And they always got canceled over this, that, or the other thing.
I want to talk about the
thing about that since you asked. There's actually a report I found when I was researching the book that had Bill Clinton in Australia and said that he gave a speech on September the 10th, 2001, the night before the attack in America. And that he had told this group of businessmen, yeah, the biggest regret of my presidency is that I didn't kill bin Laden. You know, that guy got away and I ran out of time. And man, I wish I had had the opportunity to do something about that. And I hope that the new guys, you know, really do a good job at cracking down and find him. But then he says, you know, I had one chance to kill him. Not 10. I had one. But he said, in order to do so, I would have had to carpet bomb a little village called Kandahar. And I would have had to kill all these civilians. And so I had to call the operation off. Right. But see, that's such a self-serving lie, because in fact, Kandahar is not a little village. Kandahar is one, a province, and two, a major city, the provincial capital of the province named after it there. And bin Laden lived at a farm that was on the outskirts of town, way on the outskirts of town. And don't get me wrong, because you know what? I mean, I think they said there was a swing set outside, and it was reported that some of these guys who lived at the farm with bin Laden had their families with them. But we're talking about dozens of people at the most. We're not talking about carpet bombing anything. You're talking about one good J-dam on the roof of this thing. And not that necessarily the entire Al-Qaeda war against America would have been over at that point, but he would have been over at that point. And it's just nonsense to claim that he would have had to obliterate all of Kandahar. And now maybe that's an error in the reporting too, and the way the story was retold. But that's the kind of thing I would expect for Bill Clinton to say, you know, to make some pathetic excuse like, oh yeah, no, I would have had to kill 50,000 people to kill this one guy, when that's just absolute nonsense, you know?
I want to refer to page 35 of your book. In 1996, there was a UN Oil for Food program in which it says, according to the United Nations, as many as 1 million people died from this deprivation, referring to the sanctions the U.S. and the UN had put against Iraq after the Gulf War. More than 500,000 of them children in what Americans called peacetime. So you said civilian deaths were a prime feature, not a bug, of this sanctions policy. When Madeleine Albright was asked about this on 60 Minutes, she's whether or not 500,000 dead children was worth it, she says, we think the price was worth it. How is it that such a clear blockade crime can exist and isn't brought more to light? And Bill Clinton isn't brought up for crimes against humanity with George Bush Sr. after lying us into Iraq 1 with the babies and incubators lie from Hill and Knowlton, and April Glaspie giving Saddam the green light to go and invade Kuwait after they had been caught slant drilling.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to just in my own memory of that time, I think the basic idea was Iraqis kind of hardly exist. Saddam Hussein is Hitler. And so therefore, kind of anyone around him, if they're not just subhuman vermin or some kind of thing like that, they only are just kind of imaginary beings. Like, we know that they must be there, but we can't see them. And they never show us footage of them. And they're a bunch of dirty Arabs and camel jockeys and sand N-words and these kinds of things. And if we did have footage of them talking, we wouldn't be able to understand a thing they're saying. And I mean, honestly, man, I think consciousness, I think people's just basic understanding of the size and shape of the planet Earth and just how close we are to each other has really changed in the last 30 years. And maybe partly because of the terror war and, of course, internet technology and all these kinds of things. But I think, it's the same thing as nuking the Japanese. Like, these might as well be Martians, or they might as well be animals, right? They might as well be livestock. They're alive, but in terms of the importance or their right that they have to their life, it's a separate question. It's a different question. Richard Nixon, there's a tape of Richard Nixon where he's talking with Kissinger and they're talking about bombing the dikes and maybe using nukes in Vietnam and this kind of thing. And Nixon's saying, think big, Henry, God damn it, blah, 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 and all this. But one of the things they talk about is, I think Kissinger says, look, I'm just worried. I'm not worried about the people. I'm just worried that you, sir, will be called a butcher if you just do these outright attacks against civilian populations in this way. And Nixon says something like, look, I'm the head of a state and I'm dealing with other states. And so actual people dying on the other side, I mean, that's their problem. That's not something I think about or have to be concerned with, right? Like, he's a god and he's dealing with other gods and they're on this separate level. And the question of the taking the life of individual human Vietnamese, that's just not within his purview. That's below his pay grade to take the common aphorism and turn it around. That's something for somebody else. Let some liberal cry about that or whatever. He's the head of a state. He's dealing with the head of other states. And sometimes you have to bomb the dikes. That's the way it goes, kiddo. That's the way they think of it. And so, I mean, how could they have nuked Nagasaki? How could they have nuked Hiroshima? And the answer is because why not? Their lives are forfeit. Their lives aren't even, it doesn't even matter. You know what I mean? Even the question of whether it was worth it to kill these people. That's the way it's framed in 60 Minutes. And we always criticize her for saying, yeah, it's worth it. But we're talking about murder. Worth what? You don't have the right to murder anybody for anything. Right? What if you could steal $1 billion and give it to the poor? You get to kill all the guards on the way to loot the place? I mean, this is insane. Worth what? To kill human beings. And yeah, and then to finish that quote where you were reading there, it's quotes from guys from the Air Force saying, yes, we quite deliberately in Gulf War I, Iraq War I, we bombed their waterworks, their sewage, their electricity, and we put them under these sanctions so they can't rebuild it. And the deal is, once you people overthrow Saddam for us, because you're so weak and you're so hungry and your power relative to your central state is further weakened, at some point you'll be so weak that you'll be willing to die trying to overthrow this guy. That was the logic, supposedly. Even though, and we kind of skipped this, in the after, which, what are you going to do? But in the aftermath of Iraq War I, Bush Sr. had encouraged the Shiite majority and their allied Kurdish minority to rise up against the Sunni Arab minority ruling dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. And then they sat back, even as they occupied the country, they sat back and they let him keep his tanks and attack helicopters and massacred tens of thousands of Shia and Kurds that they had encouraged to rise up. Once they realized, this is going to benefit Iran. We have Iranian-backed Iraqi militias coming across the border. Where when Jimmy Carter hired Saddam to invade Iran, a lot of these Shiite militias fled to Iran and took their side in the war. And here they come back again. Oops. So they called it off. And then, of course, this is the war that Bush Jr. picked up 8 years later, 10 years later, 12 years.
There was a great point Stefan Molyneux made in his discussion with you, was that the U.S. says supposedly we're going to sanction the people in order to get them to rise up. These are the same group of ideologues that are like so afraid to be called racist when criticizing Obama, and they expect these people under Saddam, under the Taliban or whatever, under Saddam to revolt against their government when they don't have a Second Amendment or anything. It's absolute lunacy. And the process of making the enemy look unworthy of life, it goes back to this Babies on bayonets in World War I lie. Babies in incubators lie, which I mentioned previously in 1991. Today, there's the lie that they only bomb us because they think they're going to get 72 virgins. I get that that is a belief, but that is not the motive behind the bombing. For me, it took actually seeing the videos. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to think this through. It took me seeing the Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning, war crimes videos for me to say, yeah, war's bad, but there's always collateral damage. And then I saw the videos and I'm like, that's murder, that's immoral. Is showing the videos of U.S. war crimes and the tragedies, is that a necessary step to get people to start opposing war?
Yeah, well, you know what? I'm not certain about that, although I'm glad to hear, that you came around based on that yourself. But I am certain about the inverse, right? Which is that they keep that kind of footage from the American people for exactly the reason that they're terrified that people will have the same reaction that you did. That at some point, actually, we're not talking about bombing an ant pile or bombing some inhuman Martians. We're talking about real human beings, and listen to them scream for their mom as they die with all their guts in their hands and all these kinds of things like war really is. And, that in fact, the Chelsea Manning leak includes, as far as I understand, one video, the collateral murder video, which shows two different major incidents of this Apache helicopter hunting down and killing these civilians in eastern Baghdad from 2007, from the height of the surge in 2007. I mean, think how notable that is, because you never get to see anything like that at all. They usually don't show any kind of footage at all. Back when they did during the initial invasion, all you ever see is a profile view of the soldier shooting, but you never see who he's shooting at, really. And, they embed the soldiers, embed the media with the soldiers. So all they ever report is that, Joey bravely saved Johnny today or some kind of thing. But it doesn't even have anything to do with whose side are they on? Whose side have they taken, and who are they being used against, and what part of which city are they in, and what goals are they accomplishing for who? We don't ever get to hear any of that. In fact, the whole narrative of Iraq War II was it's America and the Iraqi people versus the terrorists. Well, wow, how simple and easy. And we don't have to learn the names of any foreign political parties or anything, huh? Except that's really a far cry from the description of what happened there. It was much more like America took the side specifically of the most Iranian-backed of the Shiite parties and their militias, who eventually, with especially the help of the surge, cleansed the capital city of all the Sunni Arabs and, accomplished, won the civil war in that sense, but created the circumstances for Iraq War III and the rise of the Islamic State. In that ungoverned space that had been cut loose by America's intervention there. So, I'm sorry.
Did you see American Sniper?
No, I did not, actually.
Okay.
I didn't know about it.
Well, there's a great interview that Adam Kokesh does outside the movie theater where he asks people questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What did you think about that movie?
Well, I haven't seen the movie, but I have seen the Kokesh thing. Right, where he just turns it on everybody. He does Socrates and says, so this guy's heroically defending his country, right? Blah, blah, blah. And then he leads them to where they're talking about the Iraqis are the ones who have the right to defend their homes. And then once they realize the dissonance, then they freak out and run away and that kind of thing. But yeah.
I think that's one of the most important man on the street interviews I've seen, just because regardless of what you think of the interviewer, the logic he uses to expose this to these people, and they see that they're talking to a veteran, it's just so powerful.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I know about that movie is that they portray the enemy, and especially the Al Qaeda in Iraq guys fighting under Zarqawi in the Sunni-based insurgency. They really did butcher civilians to a great degree. But one of the propaganda points in that film is that they use power drills on their victims, on their prisoners, and torturing them. But that anecdote, in fact, comes from America's closest allies in Iraq War II, in the Badr Brigade and in the Wolf Brigade. These are the men that Bush fought an 8-year war to put in power. And they were the ones using power drills to torture people to death through the heart, through the eyeball, through the skull, and scrambling their brains with power drill bits to death These were America's allies. And damn Clint Eastwood for lying about that in that movie and spinning that around like we were protecting the Iraqi people from the monsters among them who would do such a thing, when that is absolutely 100% false and the other way around. America was inflicting this onto the people of Iraq.
Yeah, the other great propaganda ploy is Bradley Cooper's just sitting in his living room, turns on the TV, and sees the plane fly into the tower, gets this total rage within him, enlists in the military, and then goes to Iraq. Hold on.
They don't even, there's no discrepancy, right? Just, yep.
No, it's 9/11, Iraq. It's straight to it. So it's constantly creating that X is connected to Y and this kind of thing.
Well, that's exactly how Bush did it too, is people would say, but why do we have to attack Iraq? And he would say, because of September 11th.
Yeah, well,
because on that day we learned that from now on you have to start all the wars. So it sounded like he said because Saddam did it. Because, it's George Bush. He doesn't speak English very well. Why do we have to attack Iraq? Because of September 11th. Oh, I guess he's saying because Saddam did September 11th. But then when you get to the count of 7, it's hard to even leave the pause long enough before you start talking. He'd leave like this 7-beat pause. And then he'd say, because we learned a lesson that day that never can we be attacked again. So now we start the wars, which is just a total non sequitur. But he's leading you to believe that he's claiming. But if you go back and check carefully, I never really said.
Yeah, and Donald Rumsfeld was asked about that in his Netflix interview. They said, he goes, I don't think we ever said Saddam was behind 9/11. Dick Cheney on Tony Snow's show said, we never said Saddam was behind 9/11, but they're constantly using these words, just like Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Iraq, 9/11, in order to get you to associate these two things together.
Right.
You mentioned Henry Kissinger earlier. There's a more recent book called The Idealist by Niall Ferguson, which he got the intimate papers of Kissinger. And he says that one of Kissinger's great contributions to foreign policy is, whenever people have put dealing with dictators on the back burner, what happens is Hitler. So if Saddam is possibly the next Hitler, that is something we have to aggressively chase after. How do you communicate or how do you analyze that sort of foreign policy ideas being dealt with at that level?
Yeah, well, it's just a total crock, and they know it. America supports dictatorships all over the place. Dozens and dozens of them, and especially all across the Middle East. And, what's the first thing about the Nazi regime that you have to take seriously? It's not the ranting crank behind the podium. The world's lousy with ranting cranks. This guy had a Wehrmacht, right? This guy, the Nazi party, was in charge of the most powerful military force on earth. Well, not on the seas, but certainly on land and in the air at the time. And they were a force to be reckoned with. Iraq was never a force to be reckoned with. Iraq tried to invade Iran and failed and fought them for 8 years to a stalemate and to total exhaustion. At the time that the Americans took them on in Iraq War I, there was hardly anything left of their hollowed out military, and the U.S. air power and armor completely obliterated their tank divisions and all of their everything. And the guys who fled from Kuwait were just massacred by the tens of thousands as they fled in the highways of death. There are 2 different highway of death massacres in the aftermath of Iraq War I. And, all this talk about, it's the 4th largest army in the world. Back in 1991, Bill Hicks used to joke that, the Hare Krishnas are the 5th largest army. Let me tell you something. After the first 3 largest armies, there's a real big drop off, before you get to Iraq. And, total numbers of inflated conscript infantry with no gun and no boots and no ability to do a thing to anybody really doesn't amount to much. And H.W. Bush proved that in Iraq War I, where really it was a very small percentage of the bombs were smart bombs. He used to use plain old dumb bombs. They completely fought the most one-sided war that Earth has seen in a hell of a long time there, I guess since Grenada, I don't know, in Iraq War I. And then under Bill Clinton, they were under blockade and sanctions, as we've been talking about, and bombed continually under the no-fly zones, which were launched, of course, after Bush betrayed the uprisings he'd encouraged in 1991. They launched the no-fly zones mostly as an excuse to stay in Saudi Arabia and to continue to be able to threaten Iraq and Iran in their dual containment policy. And so, but under the excuse of protecting the Kurds and the Shia, they just encouraged and then betrayed. They stayed. And this was, of course, then again, back to full circle where we started here. This is a huge part of what got the U.S. attacked by bin Laden in the first place. Here, these Arab Afghan mujahideen, as they were called, who came from all over the Arab world and went to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets with American backing in the 1980s. They'd come home. They basically were just mercs looking for work. It's not like they had job skills. So what are they all going to do? And the Americans just made themselves the most obvious target in the world by putting primarily white and Christian combat forces on the Arabian Peninsula. And in order to enforce this dual containment policy and continue to bomb and blockade Iraq. And, you know, I like this quote. I didn't use it in the book because, you know, I don't want to represent these people's point of view so much to the degree where it seems like I agree with it or whatever, because their policy, of course, was then that they ought to kill American civilians in response, which is insane. But, you know, people ought to be able to understand. And I don't even know if this is really in the Quran or what, but there's a quote where bin Laden says that in the Quran, there's a story of an old lady who had a cat, I guess a kitten, and she wouldn't feed it, but nor would she let it outside to go and try to fend for itself and feed itself either. And so then Allah sent her to hell forever for that, because even though this wasn't a person, it was just a kitten, that kind of cruelty gets rewarded with like cruelty for eternity, because that's the way they roll over there, or whatever the hell. And then he says, so what do you think Allah thinks of Bill Clinton, who would starve hundreds of thousands of children to death, according to his own United Nations, which is pretty much a correct characterization of the UN, an American cat's paw for American imperial power in the world. And when American universities, studies, and so forth are coming forward and saying, listen, this is a genocide against a civilian population. What do you... And then he says, how come your blood is blood, but our blood is just water? Is that what you think? Well, we'll show you. Which, again, just like you started the show, you turn any of this stuff around, right? America is the defeated, bankrupt power at the end of the Cold War, and the Chinese and the Russians come and gang up on us and treat us this way, blockade and starve and bomb our people. And how would we react? We would die killing them. That's what we would do until they were all dead and gone from our shores. Even if we had to travel overseas and blow up their civilian sites, I guess some Americans would, no question, if the roles were reversed. In fact, look at the fact that we still fight this war just because of September 11th and a couple of, you know, mostly failed attacks. I guess there's been a couple of successful attacks here, but with, you know, less than 100 casualties, they're still horrible, right? Like Orlando. I mean, this is horrible stuff, but that was really mostly just a homegrown type of thing anyway. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So I hardly ever hear of Al-Qaeda anymore. I only hear of ISIS, ISIL, or Daesh. What happened to Al-Qaeda? Why don't we hear about them so much?
Oh, man. Well, there's really, I guess, two major parts to this. The first one is what was left of the group, the real core group of Al-Qaeda back in 2001 was just a few hundred guys. About half of them died at Tora Bora, and then the other half got away. And the CIA under Obama killed most of the rest of them with drones. They were hiding out with the Tariqi Taliban up in the tribal territories, and the CIA pretty much finished decimating them and moved on. It was just a matter of, you know, going down the list. And it was something that that Obama was determined to do from the time he took office, as he told the CIA to really step it up in Pakistan. And they pretty much did that. But then, of course, the worst part of the answer is the one coming here, is that right at the time that Obama was putting Osama down, finally, like I said, dead and loving it, Osama was getting exactly what he wanted. And Obama turned right around and took Osama's side in Libya, and the side of his men, the side of the Libyan veterans of Al-Qaeda in Iraq from Iraq War II. And so when it's the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and Ansar al-Sharia and they're veterans of Iraq War II, but you got a publicity stunt for Hillary Clinton you're trying to pull off against, Muammar Gaddafi here, then you got to play down the fact that these guys are a bunch of jihadist terrorists. And instead you just say, well, no, they're moderate rebel fighters. And then as you can even read about in the New York Times, it's Hillary Clinton's bank shot. We're going to take the jihadists and the guns from Libya and we're going to funnel them onto Syria. In Syria, they're known as Jabhat al-Nusra, a.k.a. the moderates. Although, it depends on who you ask. Sometimes you say, moderate, al-Nusra, they are al-Qaeda and they're bad. But never mind the fact that all their friends are all of our friends, that the CIA has been backing Ahrar al-Sham, that there are other groups, al-Zinki and this, that, the other thing, that have been backed by the Saudis all along. And there's just a brand new study out by a European think tank that came out about a month ago, I guess, about how from the very beginning, and we've known this from the very beginning, that American support for the so-called vetted CIA-backed moderates in Syria has amounted to direct support for al-Nusra and the Islamic State. And they trace guns going from the CIA to the so-called moderates to Islamic State fighters in the field in a matter of weeks. And so this is not just that when the Islamic State rolled into Western Iraq and that they seized all those military bases and all the equipment that the Americans had left behind. That's a different issue, and it's bad enough the way it was, and how foolish of them to leave so much equipment behind, behind Sunni lines, instead of leaving it all with the Shia government and army that they had installed in power in Baghdad. So they were just leaving all that stuff ripe for the taking. But we're talking about the stuff the CIA was deliberately introducing into the battlefield there. It was going to the jihadists all along, and we knew it all along. It was reported from 2012, 2011, 2012, from the very beginning. Al-Qaeda in Iraq is back. This group that, Petraeus took the credit for marginalizing Al-Qaeda in Iraq during the so-called awakening in 2007. But what really happened was the tribal leaders in Iraqi Sunnistan got sick and tired of being bossed around by these jihadi foreigner types. Because the Iraqis weren't used to living like Saudis. They had a pretty, modern secularist state there. And these jihadis were nuts and they were foreigners. And so the local tribal Iraqi Sunnis, who were the real core of the insurgency, quickly marginalized these guys and got rid of them. But once the Syria war broke out in 2011, they had a huge new opportunity. And so they went from Iraq into Syria. They created Jabhat al-Nusra, and they, quickly came to dominate. From the very beginning, they dominated the so-called insurrection, the rebellion against Assad. And so that's why America doesn't talk bad about Al-Qaeda anymore, because if you just Google it, you'll see that David Petraeus said we need to really recruit these Al-Qaeda guys and outright ally with them against the Islamic State. And if you look at Foreign Affairs, there are no less than 4 different articles in Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, saying, look, Ahrar al-Sham, which was also founded by leaders of the core Al-Qaeda group with Osama bin Laden from back when, we got to ally with Ahrar al-Sham. These are our guys, or we need to go ahead and ally. There's one in Foreign Affairs. It's called Accepting Al-Qaeda. And they, for good measure, go ahead and they put Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri as the picture at the top of the article, that they're not going to try to downplay it and say, well, no, it's only this guy Jolani now, the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, and so he's not so bad. They go ahead and admit that, we're talking treason. These are the guys who are the butchers of New York City, or they're sworn to the butchers of New York City. But to us, they're the moderate rebels compared to Assad, the government that we hate. And why does America hate the Assad government? Because they're allied with Iran, which America empowered in Iraq War II. So to try to make up for that fact, they started this proxy war against Assad then in Syria and built up this jihadist force. And so this all started in 2011. And then the Islamic State, the more Iraqi dominant faction of al-Nusra, split off in 2013 and stopped taking orders from Al-Qaeda Central and became their own leadership, Central meaning some basement where Zawahiri's hiding in Pakistan, I guess. And they went ahead and started carving out a state in eastern Syria. And then a year later, they marched into western Iraq and they created the actual Islamo-fascist caliphate that had always been the ridiculous fantasy of 1, bin Laden, and 2, all of the neocons who told us that this is what we were fighting against, except that there was no caliphate. The region was dominated by a bunch of secular states, Saddam Hussein first and foremost among them. They had to turn all of Western Iraq and Eastern Syria into this lawless, war-torn territory in order for the Islamic State to then fill that vacuum. And once they did, then Obama had to turn right around and launch Iraq War III to drive them right back out again. And that was only just finished.
Okay. This is Decision Points by George W. Bush. I want to talk about Chapter 7, Afghanistan. In the beginning, he cites Abraham Lincoln. Get ready, you're getting manipulated. Lincoln's clarity of purpose. He waged a war for a necessary and noble cause, already aligning himself with Lincoln. He goes, against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. Again, al-Qaeda, Taliban, very close. He goes, I received a letter from a 4th grade girl with a father in the military that said, as much as I don't want my dad to fight, she wrote, I'm willing to give him to you. He mentions Operation Just Cause in Panama. That father, he says, took down Noriega, and that was kind of how things would go with al-Qaeda, except, that's how things would go with the Taliban. Page 186, he references Jimmy Carter in 1979 and the Mujahideen. He then says the Taliban took over after that. And then he cites Taliban atrocities. He then says the most pivotal nation was Pakistan. He was very proud that we got Pakistan on our side. And then here's where it gets interesting. He says, George Tenet warned of a retaliatory strike on the homeland was likely. We can't deter them if we've already planned a second round. I expect they have some chemical weapons. Paul Wolfowitz suggested we consider confronting Iraq as well as the Taliban. Saddam's brutal dictatorship was funding Palestinian suicide bombers. Dealing with Iraq would show major commitment to anti-terrorism, said Donald Rumsfeld, page 189. Going after Iraq would now be viewed as a bait and switch, said Colin Powell. George Tenet, CIA director, agreed. Don't hit now. It would be a mistake, he said. The first target needs to be al-Qaeda, Dick Cheney. But now is not a good time to do it. We would lose our momentum. Right now, people have to choose between the United States and the bad guys. Is there any justification for invading Afghanistan?
Well, so a couple of things. First of all, before about the invasion there, is just look how heavily Iraq was dominating the discussion, including the day of, really. So from what you just read, coming from George W. Bush, that's a bunch of excuse making and buck passing. Oh, Paul Wolfowitz told me to do it. Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney thought it was a good idea when he is the single man responsible above all of them. And, you know, people have written and can continue to write volumes on Wolfowitz's guilt, but Wolfowitz was not the president of the United States. So for George Bush to write about it that way, I think is very revealing of his character, that he would try to make excuses like that. On the other hand, look at what he's admitting, that from the beginning, they said this dictatorship that's run by a guy in a beret wearing olive green who shaves his chin every morning, that Ronald Reagan supported and sent Donald Rumsfeld to sell him the chemical weapons back when. I mean, these are the very same men. You know, George H.W. Bush was the vice president during those times. And so our disagreement over Kuwait and all that notwithstanding, if these men had honestly wanted to say to Saddam Hussein, we'll let you back into the cold as long as you make sure to continue to keep al-Qaeda out, then they could have done that. And I'm not saying America should have backed Saddam Hussein, but the idea that they had to regime change a secular dictatorship in order to fight al-Qaeda terrorism is just ridiculous and shoddy excuse making. They were taking advantage of the people's anger and confusion about the enemy, and they were getting away with bloody murder and a preconceived agenda to go to Iraq. You know, it's just absolutely crazy to think that they needed to go to Iraq. Now, as far as invading Afghanistan, you know, my position is that I think even according to former CIA officials at the highest level, people like Milton Bearden, who helped run the CIA operation against the Soviet Union during the 1980s, that the Taliban wanted to deal, that America had been in talks with them since the African embassy attacks in 1998, and they were working on getting him. And Milton Bearden said that the Taliban was trying to give him up at different times. They would say things like, oh, bin Laden, he's lost. We don't know where he is. And Milton Bearden told the Washington Post, hey, man, that's code for go ahead and kill him. He's outside of our protection. So we're not looking this week. We're turning a blind eye, Americans. Go ahead and grab him. And then the Americans would say, why are you being so intransigent? When they were not being intransigent. And that was, in the lead up to the attack. And in fact, the Washington Times correspondent who went back to the 80s and had a lot of experience there, Arnaud de Bourgrave, he interviewed Mullah Omar in the summer of 2001. And Mullah Omar was clearly seething with rage at bin Laden for getting him into trouble with the American superpower, denounced his fatwas and said, Osama bin Laden can't put out a fatwa. He has not done the 12 years of religious training required to make a religious ruling of any kind. I'm the boss around here, not him. And he's like a chicken bone stuck in my throat. I can neither swallow him nor spit him out. And this was the real division between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. In fact, there's a whole book about this, which is just great, called An Enemy We Created by Felix Kuhn and Strick Venlin Schoten. And it just shows that there was these huge divisions between the Al-Qaeda group. And, look, the Taliban are basically like a bunch of real hillbilly redneck country bumpkins from out in the middle of nowhere. So their rule over Afghanistan was sort of like if the most Appalachian folk came and marched on DC and took it over, something like that. But then these Al-Qaeda guys were highly educated Arabs from metropolitan cities. Bin Laden had an advanced degree in engineering. Ayman al-Zawahiri was a surgeon. A lot of their, fellow travelers were, worldly and accomplished men in their own ways. And they looked at the Taliban like a bunch of white trash idiots, basically. And the Taliban resented them right back, to a full degree. There were real divisions for exploiting there. And once September 11th happened, it's clear that the Taliban did not know about the attack in specific, but they did warn us that an attack was coming. And the only reason they knew is because they learned from Uzbek jihadis, had learned through the grapevine and then tipped off the Taliban about it. Al-Qaeda never told them. And they went and tried to warn the Americans and the UN that there's an attack coming against the United States, and they were ignored. And then when the attack happened, the Americans said immediately, just give them over, that's it. And the Taliban said, well, listen, if you give us evidence, then we'll turn them over to another Muslim country. And the Americans said, no negotiations, turn them over or we're going to bomb you. And they said, well,
okay. I just want to, there's a quote on page 51 of Fool's Errand. Once the attack on New York and Washington, D.C. took place, the United States threatened war. Taliban leaders again showed their willingness to negotiate and hand over bin Laden in an attempt to avoid the coming conflict. Their conditions quickly changed from stubborn but reasonable to virtually non-existent. They first demanded proof that bin Laden's guilt be provided, and then they would turn him over to the Organization of the Islamic Conference, a group of 56 Muslim nations. The articles you cite are: White House says no to Taliban demand for proof. U.S. refusal of 2001 Taliban offer gave bin Laden a free pass. U.S. rejects new Taliban offer. Bush rejects Taliban offer. New offer on bin Laden, The Guardian. Bush mentions this in his book, Decision Points, quoting from page 92. I laid out an ultimatum to the Taliban. They will hand over the terrorists or they will share their fate. We had little hope that Afghanistan leaders would heed it, but exposing their defiance to the world would firm up our justification for a military strike. Page 193, Decision Points, George W. Bush is ghostwriter. What are the implications of that?
The way he tells it was that they presumed that they were going to war no matter what, and that this was all just more or less for show. to increase the perception of justification to launch the war. That's in the president's own telling of the story. Which I really should have read that book while I was writing mine, but there's a limit. But yeah, and I think that's true. And listen, by the end, they said they would turn him over to any third country on the planet. Could have been Canada or Mexico or Britain or, you name it, the French or whoever, who would have instantly, even in the original or in the second offer, they dropped their demand for evidence and said, we'll give them to the Pakistanis or we'll give them to a Muslim country, any other Muslim country in the world. And you name any one of them would have extradited bin Laden and Zawahiri to the United States immediately. That was only a fig leaf face saving for the Taliban. They knew that. They didn't think that if they gave bin Laden over to the Pakistanis or to the Mexicans or, to any third country, Muslim or otherwise, that these people wouldn't be immediately extradited to the United States. They were just trying, to save minimal amount of face. And Bush, as you say, Bush refused, all the way down the line. There are no negotiations. Do everything I say up front or that's it. And then I don't know how well you remember the time, but they did everything they could to conflate Al-Qaeda and the Taliban together into one entity, even though it was really a lie. And it remains that way in people's mind. People don't know the difference between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban to this day, when they're entirely separate movements with entirely separate sets of goals. The Taliban never had goals outside of Afghanistan. Full stop. That's it. Al-Qaeda wanted regional revolution and civil war and a brand new caliphate someday. It's an entirely different concept.
I want to quote from page 56 of Fool's Errand. This is Donald Rumsfeld. You are quoting an article by Joel Roberts. Plans for Iraq attack began on 9/11, according to CBS News. Hard to get good case, Rumsfeld says in the document. Need to move swiftly. Near team targets need to go massive, sweep it all up. Things related and not. Best info fast. Judge whether good enough to hit SH, Saddam Hussein, at same time, not only UBL. Talk with PW, Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, for additional support for connecting UBL. That is blatantly saying we're planning Iraq years before the invasion, years before all of a sudden this WMD scare. How is that not treasonous? How is this bastard not behind bars?
Well, and we know that from his first Treasury Secretary, Paul O'Neill, who it's not like this guy's a radical leftist. He was the CEO of Alcoa. This metal smelting concern here in Texas. And he said from the very first cabinet meeting they held, it was, how are we going to get into Iraq? What are we going to do to justify the war with Iraq? And whether it's Bush's telling or whether it's the Chilcot report or Richard Clark, who was the head of counterterrorism at the time, or any of these guys, Bob Woodward's very official accounts in his books, that from the very beginning, from the very first day, they were talking about Iraq. And the very real question they were pondering, no secret about it, was, should we attack Iraq at the same time as Afghanistan? Or Wolfowitz was even saying we should attack them first. And eventually it came down to Tony Blair came to town and said, guys, seriously, look, I promise the UK will be with you when you attack Iraq. If you promise you'll at least go after Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan first, or otherwise this is just going to look too crazy. In other words, you might be able to sell to the Americans that Iraq is behind 9/11 and Al-Qaeda, but you're not going to be able to sell that to the rest of the world. They're just not going to be made to believe that nonsense. And so we're going to have to come up with a separate pretext. And then, of course, the separate pretext, and this is especially in the words of the British, they were terrified. Their justice minister, exactly what they call him, had written that, listen, we could all go to prison for war crimes unless we can definitely frame this up to look like Iraq is in violation of these United Nations resolutions banning these weapons. Because under the world law America created under the United Nations after World War II, aggressive war is illegal. Borders of states on earth are not allowed to change ever again by force, only by negotiation and according to the world law. And no country may launch a war against any other country or they're in violation of the law. The exception is if the UN Security Council votes on it and says it's okay. Now, in this case, they basically just fudged it. And they had two resolutions, they were supposed to have two resolutions. And the first one said Saddam better let the inspectors back in or else there will be consequences. But they swore up and down that that did not mean that there will be a war and that they would need a separate resolution to launch the war. And then it became clear they weren't going to get their separate resolution. The inspectors couldn't find anything. It was obvious the Americans were in a hurry to launch the war before the inspectors could really say, we're done. There's nothing. And we know it. And so they went ahead and launched the war anyway and didn't even hold the second vote. They just said, forget about it. But the whole thing there was just trying to build up a legal pretext because, I mean, and it sounds funny, right? The idea that somebody like Tony Blair, the British prime minister, could go to prison. But that's what his lawyers were telling him. We need an international law pretext for starting this war, or we are guilty of the war crime of aggressive war, which is against the law.
Well, yeah, as early as 1998, the Project for a New American Century wrote a letter to Bill Clinton trying to justify an Iraq invasion. As far as Saddam's WMD UN inspections, Israel's not letting them inspect. If it weren't for the whistleblower Mordecai Vanunu, we probably wouldn't know any of this stuff. A very important part in your book, page 57, you quote from General Wesley Clark, Way's presidential bid interview with Amy Goodman. General Wesley Clark says, a memo that had been drawn up by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, the memo included a list of 7 countries to be subject to U.S. regime change, including Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finally, Iran. What are the implications of that, and how is that not all over the news?
Well, you just said it's Israel, right? That's not just Rumsfeld. That's the neoconservatives. And so hang that for a second. But first of all, what do we know about that entire list of countries that you just named? Not a single one of them had anything to do with September 11th or any Al-Qaeda attacks on the United States. Not a single one of them had a relationship with Al-Qaeda at all. Not even Sudan. I mean, even the Sudanese had been working with the Americans on Al-Qaeda during that time. Saddam certainly was Osama's enemy. No question about the Ayatollahs in Iran. And on down the list. None of this had anything to do with the war with Al-Qaeda. But of course, I'm sure you noticed, a lot of people should have noticed on the night of September 11th, Bush declared war. And then again that Friday in his second talk, he declared war on terrorism, not Al-Qaeda. And terrorism was just a tactic. And so that was an open check to, well, wait a minute. When Hezbollah defends themselves from Israeli incursions, does that count as terrorism? And does that mean we can nuke Tehran now? Or what are the borders of this concept, this war on terror? Even a lot of times they erase the ism from, now it's not the tactic. Now it's your emotional response to a possible tactic is the war that they're waging, this forever conflict in the name of and whatever. And it just goes to show that it had nothing to do that the terror war, as Bush put it, you just quoted him saying that, or quoted Powell telling Bush quotes Powell saying it would be a bait and switch. That's exactly what it was. It was a bait and switch. And if you look at, the root of all of this, it goes back to the Yinon plan, which was written in 1980 by an Israeli military theoretician named Oded Yinon. And this was later adapted into the clean break strategy and so forth. And what they basically say is that every state in the region is an enemy of Israel just for being a state. And they ought to be all reduced as much as possible to the smallest warring tribal factions that we can reduce them to. And that's the only way to keep Israel safe. And it's actually funny, if you take the time to read the Oded Yinon plan, it says, global Soviet communism is sure to conquer the entire planet any day now, and the Americans will all be destroyed and washed away, and no one will be left to protect us. And so our only choice is to fragment and atomize the Arab world. And it's just the rantings of a crazy person. It's absolutely insane. I mean, think of the, well, anyway, it didn't work out that way at all. This horrible new future that Israel was facing was completely a terrible nightmare fantasy of theirs, but it wasn't even true at all. But the solution remained. And then if you look at the clean break, this was Richard Pearl, David Wormser, Douglas Feith, and a few other neocons who signed the clean break. And then the companion piece is called Coping with Crumbling States. And they're both written in 96 for the then new first Netanyahu administration in Israel. And he said, we got to weaken Hezbollah, which is backed by Syria and Iran. And so the way to weaken Hezbollah is to focus on getting rid of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Huh? Well, so what had happened was Ahmed Chalabi, who was being bankrolled by Iran, although clearly he obviously had his own reasons here. This was the head of the Iraqi National Congress, was telling these neocons that a new Shiite supermajority state in Iraq, it won't be a cat's paw of Iran at all. It'll be a close ally of Israel. We'll build a water and oil pipeline to Haifa from Mosul, and we'll have a Hashemite king. We'll put in a cousin of the king of Jordan, and we'll stick it to the Baathists and the Sunnis, and the Shia will love it because they just love taking orders and being bossed around by Hashemite kings and whoever else. Just don't check the history books on that, and it'll be great. And then, of course, by the time of the Iraq invasion, the Hashemite king had changed to Chalabi himself, would be the new viceroy, American installed dictator of Iraq after Iraq War II. That was the neoconservatives' plan. And they bought this nonsense. And so that's not to acquit them and say they meant well. It was a premeditated murder plot for the advantage of a foreign state at the obvious detriment of the United States. But then also they're stupid. And it's worth addressing that because I think if you go through and you talk about the people in charge making the decisions and what they think, not just what they claim, but what they quite apparently think is going to happen in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, that they're wrong all the time, that they fail and they're stupid all the time. Oh, it's going to be great. We're going to get rid of Assad. No, you're just going to empower Hezbollah and Iran in Iraq even more, in Syria even more. In fact, you're going to bring the Russians back to the Middle East where they haven't been since the Soviet Union fell apart. The whole thing blew up right in your face. You created the Islamic State. Now you got to launch a whole new war to get rid of it. And this thing is crazy. But then people hear that and what they hear is that I'm making excuses for these people, that somehow they're trying their best, but only it keeps not working out. But I never said that. All I said was you have a bunch of horrifying premeditated murder plots, all of which go awry. But that doesn't make them innocent mistakes at all. That just means that the people in charge of administering the world's most violent force are absolutely incompetent. And I think half the time they really don't have half a clue about what the hell they think they're doing. And Iraq War II is a perfect example of that they're going to turn over the country and fight a whole civil war for the Shiite factions, which have dominance over the supermajority population of the country. They're going to fight a whole civil war for them and help them cleanse the capital city of the last of the Sunni Arabs. But then, they're going to make themselves the slaves of the middle part of North America forever when they have blood kinship and religious kinship with Iran next door and to the east, like directly adjacent to them. And that doesn't mean that they're the absolute, that they're owned by Tehran. They absolutely are closer to Iran than the US, and they're going to stay that way forever now. And the idea that it was ever going to be different, that it could have ever been different, you would have had to be Richard Pearl listening to Ahmed Chalabi and saying, wow, I'm really reassured. I can't wait till, Iraq, turns on every single one of their interests and turns themselves over to America and Israel to be our servants forevermore.
You mentioned a lot of important things there. I just want to recap. The Oded Yanan plan, I believe, is called A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s. You mentioned the document A Clean Break. There's the Greater Israel Plan. There's also Rebuilding America's Defenses by the Project for a New American Century. And what you were saying about the war on terrorism, the war on terror, it's always these general terms that allow the elites to get away with absolute murder. Now, I want to talk about Iraq. This is Sean Hannity's book, Deliver Us from Evil. I want to address the best arguments for the invasion of Iraq, starting on page 100. They know he developed and used chemical weapons against the Iranian army and against his own people, the Kurds in northern Iraq. Iraq is positioned right next to three of the world's richest oil states. Once Saddam manages to obtain a nuclear device, how could he have been stopped from dominating Kuwait, Iran, Saudi Arabia? What could we have done if he had seized access to some 60% of the world's oil supplies? Hannity goes on to criticize appeasement. A serious WMD attack on just one major American city could cause devastating life. The Bush administration saw early that we could not repeat the mistake of 9/11. We could no longer wait for the enemy to attack again. even in the absence of actual WMDs, though it's most important to know that those combing through the remains of Saddam's regime in Iraq have already turned up incontrovertible evidence of intent. Finally, before I stick it over to you, this is a book called Conservative Comebacks to Liberal Lies. Most of it's bullshit. Claim 1, Iraq didn't attack us on 9/11. It was not an imminent threat and was no part of the war on terror. Conservative response, according to this gentleman. The Germans didn't attack us in World War II either. The Japanese did. How do you address the pro-Iraq arguments? Are there any good arguments for invading Iraq?
You know, I kind of feel bad that I think those really are all the best ones. It's not like you're setting up straw men. This is actually their best claims. So overall, first of all, notice the massive begged question here, the conclusion that we're supposed to start with and presume that Saddam Hussein can't be negotiated with, that we can't just send Donald Rumsfeld over there to shake his hand again and read him the riot act and tell him, you want to be friends again? You have no choice. You're our friend again. And this is what you're going to do. And that's as simple as that. So even if you presume all of this and that and danger and horror and whatever, he doesn't even bother to try to prove that Saddam Hussein could not be negotiated with. That and in fact, look at how ridiculous it was, especially going back, with the hindsight, 2020, this and that. Their excuse was, well, you can't negotiate with evil. If you negotiate with them, then that gives them credibility and legitimacy and stature, because that's what America bestows in spades, is legitimacy if they meet with any foreign leader. And what a pathetic and ridiculous and half-assed excuse that was. That was the best that Karl Rove and them could come up with at the White House Iraq group, was that Saddam is bad, and therefore you can't deal with him. Now, this is actually my protest sign for Iraq War II out in front. It was actually February 28th, 2003. I stood out in front of the Capitol alone with a sign that said, "Forget Waco," because this is exactly what happened at Waco. The guy's crazy, so you can't negotiate with him. He's got these banned weapons, and he's bad to his own people, and so we have no choice. Right? When that was absolutely all a bunch of lies against David Koresh, and it was the exact same script that they were using against Saddam Hussein. And again, all full of begged questions and assumed premises about the complete irrational and incorrigible nature of the threat. So now go back to, let me try to remember these specifically. First, he used chemical weapons on Iran. Yeah, Ronald Reagan helped him. And it was Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan helped Saddam Hussein throughout the entire Iran-Iraq war. And they armed him with chemical weapons, just as the British and the French did. And Ronald Reagan let him use American military intelligence and satellite data in order to target the Iranian conscript armies of, defenseless. I mean, they didn't even have rifles, these kids, a lot of them, the Iranian conscripts, dying in these human wave attacks. And America was 100% complicit in that, and including when they attacked the Kurds at Halabja, which they made such a big deal about on the eve of Iraq War II. The Reagan administration put out a fake report by the DIA claiming that it was Iran that had gassed the Kurds at Halabja and that Saddam had nothing to do with it. So not only was he using their chemical weapons when he did it, they made up excuses for him, and in the, under the international community and everything. They didn't just put it in the Washington Times. I mean, this was their argument at the United Nations, was defending Saddam Hussein for his use of gas at Halabja. And so that's, in other words, yeah, he was a horrible fascist murderer. That's why he worked for the United States of America in the first place, to, repeat what used to be an old cliche, which I guess has fallen out of favor. But that's how he got the job, is he's a vicious fascist murderer. He fit right in with America's scheme for dominating the Middle East for a very long time. Now, I think the second, and you can check your book and make sure I don't skip any here, but the second major claim there is that he was sure to seize Saudi Arabia, sure to seize Kuwait and Iran and consolidate power over all the oil in the world. But again, why are we to believe that that is true, when in fact the history of his invasion of Kuwait is that the Kuwaitis were really screwing him? He had borrowed a bunch of money from UAE and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia in order to wage the Iran-Iraq war in the name of protecting them, in fact, from the spreading Iranian revolution. There are Shiite populations in Bahrain and right over the oil lands in Saudi Arabia, in fact. And of course, Saddam was actually trying to preempt his own supermajority Shiite population a bit, I think, by invading Iran and conscripting them into his army to invade Iran at the time. So when the war was over, Saddam, they were all calling in their loans. Hussein couldn't pay them back. Oil was selling at like $10 a barrel. He couldn't rebuild his country after the war at all, or rebuild his forces after the war. He couldn't afford to pay them back their loans. Instead of giving him the slightest bit of breathing room, they all acted in bad faith and put the screws to him. And he complained to the Americans repeatedly that, look, you know, the Kuwaitis are really trying my patience here. And part of it was not just the way that they kept, you know, setting up dates for talks and then not showing up and this kind of thing. They were also overproducing from shared oil wells. A lot of the times people say they were slant drilling under the border, but that's not exactly right. It's a giant shared oil field there right at the border region, and which was actually not exactly marked, you know, with perfection at the time anyway, but they were overproducing compared to the agreed upon quota from the shared oil well there. And so all of this was explained to the American ambassador, who told Saddam Hussein, in effect, you have a green light to go ahead and attack Kuwait and occupy their northern oil fields. And in fact, April Glaspie, you mentioned her earlier. She later told the New York Times, well, we didn't think he was going to take the whole country. He's supposed to just occupy the northern oil fields. This is supposed to be, you know, a punitive raid, basically. And then he, you know, Saddam got carried away and went all the way to the sea and seized Kuwait City and looted all their gold and kind of went nuts and took over the whole country. And then the Brits freaked out. It was Margaret Thatcher then challenged George Bush Sr.'s manhood on TV and said, don't go wobbly on me now, George. You know, in other words, you can't be less of a man than a woman, can you? And so he said, no, of course not. Let's launch a war in order to, so I can feel better about myself, in part. And of course, the imperialists and the Israel lobby and the neocons and all these guys had all their own interests in climbing on that bandwagon for starting that war. So in other words, Hussein, not to justify what he did, but just to explain, his back was to the wall when he invaded Kuwait. And the story that he was ever going to invade Saudi Arabia was made up out of whole cloth, and it was disproven as an absolute lie before Iraq War I ever started. The St. Petersburg, Florida Times got satellite photos from the Russians that showed that all the claimed tank columns lining up in the Iraqi and Kuwaiti desert preparing to roll on Riyadh were make-believe. They didn't exist. And I actually know a guy who was in Air Force intelligence at the time who verifies personally to me that that's right, that they had the pictures. There's nothing but empty desert out there. And this was just a lie that they told the king of Saudi Arabia to get his writ to occupy the country, to wage Iraq War I, to kick Iraq back out of Kuwait again. So you can see, again, another pile of begged questions from Sean Hannity here, that we just know that Saddam Hussein is the most ambitious psychopathic leader ever since forever without demonstrating that at all. And now, in fact, look at where his country was in 2003. He'd been under complete blockade, no-fly zone bombings and sanctions for 12 years. His country, his military forces had already been smashed. Kurdistan up in the north was a completely autonomous region under American protection. He had no real military force, just police force on the ground in southern Iraqi Shiistan. And the real rule of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq only extended to Fallujah, Samarra, and to Crete, and I guess up into Mosul. But they had much more limited authority in the south. He didn't even rule his own whole country. As Ron Paul complained before the war when he voted against the congressional resolution, he said, we've been patrolling and bombing the skies, from the skies over Iraq for 12 years, and he's never shot down a single one of our planes this whole time. He has no Navy, he has no Army, he has no nothing. He's a threat to nobody. Okay, now I'm sorry, what was the next point after he's going to invade Saudi Arabia and Iran again, I guess? Only this time without permission from the Reaganites?
From page 151, the Bush administration saw early that we could not repeat the mistake of 9/11. We could no longer wait for the enemy to attack once again.
And look what he does right there, and look at how simple-minded you would have to be to buy that, of what he claims there. First of all, this is the exact lie I was referring to earlier. Why do we have to attack Iraq? Because of September 11th. You thought I said because Iraq did it, but no, just because we learned the lesson that day that now we start all the wars. And then what's this the enemy talk? Other than the most obvious obfuscation. I mean, can't you even imagine the discussion between Hannity and his editor here? Like, what are we going to do when actually Iraq didn't do anything to us ever? I know, we'll just call them the enemy and we'll just say that they are, and then that's it. And then, okay. But who says Iraq was ever going to attack America, had ever attacked America, had any motive to attack America? Only liars. Only liars who are completely full of total nonsense and have no grasp of reality whatsoever. In fact, the time of the invasion, Saddam was basically senile, writing an old romance novel, and had outsourced most of his policy to his subordinates. You know, the whole thing is just crazy. Okay, and then the next lie was what again?
Even in the absence of actual weapons of mass destruction, though, it's important to know that those combing through the remains of Saddam's regime in Iraq have already turned up incontrovertible evidence of intent. He then posts these bullet points.
And, well, I mean, if you could cite something more specific, that'd be nice. Otherwise, it's just a claim. It doesn't mean a thing.
Well, that's kind of what you get when you buy a Sean Hannity book.
Yeah, intent. I mean, they're guilty of the thought crime that I claim that you think that as soon as I turn my back, you're going to start doing a thing you're not doing. I mean, that obviously is deliberately not falsifiable. And
so,
the fact of the matter is they had completely obliterated all other weapons of mass destruction programs and stockpiles in 1991. It's true they lied after the war and claimed they destroyed it all when they hadn't. But they did then. They got caught immediately, and they did destroy it all by the end of 1991. The UN weapons inspectors knew this for a fact. In 1995, the UN itself was ready to certify Iraq weapons of mass destruction free in 1997 when Madeleine Albright preempted that with her speech, which I cite in the book, where she says that the sanctions will remain on Iraq no matter what until regime change is accomplished and Saddam Hussein is driven from office. And so non-proliferation was no longer even the excuse by then. And it was an absolute lie that they had any weapons of mass destruction programs, and certainly not, as they lied to us, some kind of Manhattan Project in Iraq to make nuclear weapons and use them against America. And they were lying when they claimed that they believed that this was real, when they claimed that they thought that Saddam Hussein is going to nuke you and your mom in your jammies in the middle of the night if we don't protect you first. They didn't think that. They were lying to you. It's as simple as that.
From the other book, the supposed liberal claim is Iraq didn't attack us on 9/11, was not an imminent threat, and was not part of the real war on terror. The conservative rebuttal, according to Greg Jackson in this book, the Germans didn't attack us in World War II either. The Japanese did. How do you respond to that?
Official alliance with Japan, and they declared war on the United States. So, SUCKIT, dude. I don't know what the hell argument that's supposed to be. That's not an argument at all. He might as well say, yeah, well, so that's why we're going to carpet bomb Rio de Janeiro. Germany didn't attack us at Pearl Harbor, so now we can attack whoever we want. That has nothing to do whatsoever. When, in fact, the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese had a treaty alliance. And Hitler declared war on the United States. Now, there's a lot to talk about World War II if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But on the face of it, Saddam Hussein was enemies with al-Qaeda. He had nothing to do with al-Qaeda. Again, you notice how the crux of their argument has to always remain unsaid, that you're just supposed to have to fill it in. That, well, the enemy, I mean, I guess Hannity's saying that he knows and I can trust him that Saddam is friends with Osama. But that was never true.
Phil Valentine's book, The Conservative Handbook, forward by Sean Hannity, military strength deters aggression, peace through strength. He refers to the fall of the Soviet Union being a justification for an imperial American foreign policy. How do you respond to the people who believe in peace through strength, military?
Non sequitur. We're not talking about peace. We're talking about starting wars. Peace through strength means you sit there strong and say, don't mess with me. It doesn't mean you go around overthrowing secular dictatorship, keeping al-Qaeda down, or after secular dictatorship, keeping al-Qaeda down. And this is crazy. What peace are they talking about? They're just lying. There's no peace. It's permanent war. It's world empire. And what it frankly is, if you only care about Americans, it's murder-suicide. It's destroying our society. You might have noticed, the amount of freedom we've lost and the amount of centralization of power in Washington, D.C. in the name of this threat. At least you can give it to the Cold Warriors that the Soviet Union and communist China really existed. Al-Qaeda at the time this war started was 400 men. They didn't control a single block. They didn't control a county anywhere in the world, nor would they ever. And America's wars have grown their strength from 400 men to 40,000. And as I was saying, in Syria, built them from when they'd luckily been defeated. Even though Bush gave them all of Western Iraq, the Western Iraqis took it back from them again. But then Obama gave them Syria for years and turned them into this nightmare. And so, peace through strength. In other words, world empire, kill millions of people, create new enemies endlessly until our country tears itself apart. Really, really great. Yeah, speak softly and carry a big stick, huh?
And you quote Zbigniew Brzezinski sending a memo to Jimmy Carter in 1979 saying that this will be America's chance to give the Soviet Union their Vietnam. What are the implications of that memo?
All right. Well, so Vietnam by then was shorthand for a terrible, horrible no-win catastrophe that you never should have done, that bankrupts your country, that causes, deep societal divisions back home, and is a giant fool's errand, a self-destructive mission. And so that was what it meant. One word, Vietnam, a giant, horrible, stupid thing you never should have done is what it meant. And the American people had what was called the Vietnam Syndrome. And as part of that, what happened was, one of the consequences was after they pulled out of Vietnam, they stepped up arms sales to Iran in order to keep the military industrial complex firms humming, which of course just helped the Shah get further out of control and provoke the revolution against him a few years later as part of that same backlash. But also it meant that the American people had the lamented Vietnam Syndrome, which meant that so many of their sons had died in the last one and the one before that and the one before that. They didn't want to do this anymore. And the problem for the international imperial theorists was that our containment policy required a lot of American activity abroad. And in the post-Nixon era, it was just a bad time for that kind of, adventurers. And in fact, Nixon had helped short circuit all that Cold War brinksmanship himself by making a deal with Mao Zedong and beginning the détente relationship and dialing down brinksmanship with the Soviet Union at the time. Well, compared to Kissinger, who was really Nelson Rockefeller's protege, David Rockefeller's protege, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was much more hawkish. And what he wanted to do was take advantage of the Vietnam Syndrome and say, okay, if we can't contain them, let's bait them into overexpansion. And let's use, basically a judo maneuver to provoke them into making this self-destructive error. Let's provoke them into invading Afghanistan. Now, they did invade Afghanistan in Christmas of 1979, a few months after Jimmy Carter signed the finding that Brzezinski had him sign in July. Although I don't think it's really the case necessarily that American intervention then is what necessarily caused the Soviet intervention. But that was the motive, according to Brzezinski and Robert Gates, who was deputy director of the CIA at the time. They were attempting to provoke the Soviet Union into invading Afghanistan to prop up their communist sock puppet dictator there. In fact, what they did was the KGB shot him in the head their first day in town and replaced him. And that was the real reason they resigned, is because their dictator, their sock puppet, was too communist and was too disruptive and was torturing and murdering and fomenting civil war and destabilization in Afghanistan. And the Soviets invaded basically to put an end to that, and then found themselves faced with this Mujahideen insurgency that their guy had provoked. And then the Americans, the Saudis, and the Pakistanis doubled and tripled down on that support all through the 1980s in order to bog them down and bleed them to bankruptcy. And so you can even see this in Rambo 3. There's a famous scene where Rambo's superior officer and hero and mentor, Trotman, is on a secret mission in Afghanistan, helping the Mujahideen, and he's captured by the KGB. And he says, these people never give in to an invading army. Your effort here is doomed. And we've already had our Vietnam. Now you're going to have yours. And the point there about quoting Rambo is just to say that in the 1980s, this was no secret. In the 1980s, this was the most overt, covert operation ever. And everybody knew about it. And they even put out a Rambo movie to kind of explain it and propagandize the motive behind it to the American people. And that was what it was all about. So, you would think that the Americans could learn. Well, wait a minute. If we were trying to give the Soviets their own, quote, Vietnam, shorthand for absolute disaster in Afghanistan, and if Osama and his men were trying to replicate that exact effect against us now, then what else are we doing but giving ourselves our own Vietnam again? When we're the ones who, of all people, are the ones teaching this lesson, and now we have to be the victims of it again. And so, here we are. And, continuing with our leaders, continuing to live out bin Laden's script for them.
Very important book by Zbigniew Brzezinski is The Grand Chessboard. I want to quote a few things that he says. The defeat and collapse of the Soviet Union was the final step in the rapid ascendance of a Western Hemisphere power, the United States, as the sole and indeed first truly global power. But in the meantime, it is imperative that no Eurasian challenger emerges capable of dominating Eurasia, thus also America. The formulation of a comprehensive and integrated Eurasian geostrategy is therefore the purpose of this book. He says, the attitude of the American public towards the external projection of American power has been much more ambivalent. The public supported America's engagement in World War II largely because of the shock effect of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. He then goes on and says, imperial geostrategies are to prevent the collusion and maintain security dependence, keep the barbarians from coming together. Almost done. The most immediate task is to make certain that no state or combination of states gains the capacity to expel the United States from Eurasia. And he compares it to a chessboard. Think several moves ahead, 5, 10, 20 years. And then the final thing he says is, moreover, as America becomes an increasingly multicultural society, it may find it more difficult to fashion a consensus on foreign policy issues, except in the circumstances of a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat. Page 211. Is the war on terror is it safe to say the war on terror is a lie? That was written in 1997.
Sure. Well, and people point to statements a lot like that in the Project for a New American Century report that you mentioned earlier, Rebuilding America's Defenses. On the other hand, I think this is kind of a common trope and was in the 90s, that how do you get the inward-looking American people? After all, we are from the New World. We are isolated from the problems of the old. That was kind of the point of our grandparents fleeing here for the most part in the first place. And so we can mind our own business and be free and stay out of these kinds of troubles and that kind of thing. So, it does make sense that, unless something really bad happens to mobilize Americans in reaction, we may not be able to get what we want. Now, if you want to, begin speculating from there, the degree to which they recognize their own symbiotic relationship with these terrorists and deliberately help them to thrive. And these are those ways. I mean, certainly we already talked about their role in promoting them in the 80s and promoting them in Syria. I could add that Bill Clinton took the side of al-Qaeda in Bosnia, Chechnya, and in Kosovo in the 1990s. And even, the CIA was sponsoring training camps for Uyghur fighters in Afghanistan as late as the summer of 2001. So there's, certainly a lot of that. But, honestly, just like they used to say, and I quote in the book, it was basically a figure of speech, a cliche among the joint staff at the Pentagon, that terrorism is a small price to pay for being a superpower. And now they probably weren't thinking of September 11th sized attacks. They could have had the imagination to think, what if Ramzi Youssef had succeeded and brought both towers down in 93? But it makes sense that they were thinking, man, truck bombing here, a truck bombing there, mostly overseas. Who cares? What are we going to do? We're going to give up our whole empire over a couple of pinprick attacks here or there or the other thing. It just wasn't their highest priority. And then when terrorist attacks do happen, well, great. We always just pretend that history began yesterday, and this is why we fight. When in fact, the empire, of course, preceded the terrorist reaction really by decades, or by a solid decade before Al-Qaeda's war against America ever began. But then, so to give credit to the truthers, as I like to say, I don't really agree, but Bush and Cheney and the neocons, they might as well have done it themselves. And for that matter, Obama may as well have been in on it too, to the degree to which they have exploited it for the interests of the American state and taken advantage of the grief and anger of the American people in order to exploit it and get away with accomplishing their other agendas. I mean, this is the height of evil. This is the worst level of premeditated type murder that you could come up with here. It's really sickening what they've done.
Regarding,
one more thing about the grand chessboard here. Imagine what he's saying here to go back to the context here. He's saying the middle part of North America must dominate Eurasia forever. We have the sea power to dominate all the waterways. But if we're going to really dominate Eurasia, having NATO in Western Europe and having all our allies in Korea and Japan and Australia and everybody in the Pacific, that's all great. But what we really need is a big foothold in Central Asia. And only then can we really be the dominant power in the Middle East. And this is a big part of why we stay. And he says, our big priority in Central Asia now must be to back the China, Pakistan, Taliban axis to keep the Iranians, the Indians, and the Russians out. That's in 1997. Of course, we've been fighting the exact opposite war since 2001, fighting against the China, Pakistan, Taliban axis for India, Russia, and China. I said it in the other order. Iran, Russia, and I'm sorry, I said the second part of that. Since 2001, we've been fighting for Iran, Russia, and India's friends against the Chinese, Pakistani, Taliban axis. So is it that he was completely wrong about what America's interests were back then, or we're doing the exact opposite thing that we're supposed to be doing since then, or that it doesn't matter what the excuse is? The point is we need to have, for some reason, some bases in Central Asia, ultimately, so we can threaten Russia. Because if we weren't the ones who dominate that region, then Russia naturally would, which isn't necessarily true, by the way. But that's the presumption, and that's why we're there. And that's, you talk about preventing any near-peer competitor rising power. This is part of it. Who could possibly be powerful enough to be independent from us and pose a threat not to us, but to our government's hegemony over the world? Russia, China, and Iran, and India. And, so the countries that, the Indians are much more our friends than the other three. But this is what we're working on, is making sure that the middle part of North America remains the dominant power in Eurasia forever, the world island, as Brzezinski calls it, quoting Alfred Mackinder. And it's crazy. And it's an equation for bankruptcy. It's the kind of thing that you would expect a Rockefeller and a Democrat to come up with. But it makes no sense if you actually work for a living and have to pay taxes and are looking at the inflationary boom bust cycle that comes with all the funny money that they have to print and all the money they have to borrow in order to make these wars seem cheap and free and delay their cost effect on the rest of us. It's a disaster for our country, even if it's good for the power and influence and ambition of the men in New York and DC.
Well, that's why I'm terrified about this Russia gate thing, just because, as we said earlier, the elites have justified wars based on much less. As far as deception involving war, I'm going to quote a book, The Lusitania by Colin Simpson. He cites this newspaper article that media outlets knew that the Lusitania was in trouble. He quotes a conversation between Colonel Edward House, Woodrow Wilson's right-hand man, and Sir Edward Grey. What will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board? House responded, I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into war. That's according to The Intimate Papers of Colonel Edward House. This book, Day of Deceit by Robert Stinnett, cites documents from the Freedom of Information Act.
First of all, I just want to say thank you. I can retire now. You're here to pick up all of my slack. I can go away. You've done the work. You're ready.
I just want to keep you on here for a couple more minutes. Is that okay?
Oh, I'm sorry. You missed my joke, man. I was just saying that obviously I was just complimenting your research here.
Oh, thank you. So this is a document called the McCullen Memo. And at the end of it, it states, complete embargo all U.S. trade with Japan in collaboration with similar embargo imposed on the British Empire. If these means could be to lead Japan to commit the first overt act of war, so much the better. At all events, we must be fully prepared to accept the threat of war. Months later, the New York Times, July 26, 1941, announced the Export Control Act and the U.S.-Britain freezing of Japan's assets in America.
Well, not just, in fact, they went through point by point and they implemented all 8 points of the plank of A through H there in the McCullen Memo in order.
Absolutely. And then I'm going to give it back to you here. In the summary at the end of it, page 276, Day of Deceit, Robert Stinnett, it is to the interest of the United States to eliminate Japan's threat in the Pacific at the earliest opportunity by taking prompt and aggressive action against Japan. You referred to it as a political offensive. You mentioned, do you want to get into World War II? Earlier, yes. The reason I cite those is because there's such a history of deception behind war that when we say it now, it seems like, oh, you're a Trump hater, you're a Bush hater. No, there's a real history of deception behind this stuff. What are some historical lies that you think are important for people to know regarding the World Wars, Vietnam even? Can you go with that a little?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I want to mention that Thaddeus Russell at Renegade University did a thing recently about World War II, where he says that FDR talked about how to get into a war with Japan at his second cabinet meeting in 1933. So just like we talked about with Paul O'Neill and George Bush in 2001, that he was talking about getting into a war with Japan back 8 years before the thing finally broke out. And he really explains how Roosevelt was brought up on these theories of American naval dominance that depended on breaking Japan, which is, of course, interesting because it was his uncle, Theodore Roosevelt, that had taken Japan's side in the Russo-Japanese War and had helped to broker their alliance with Britain. And then it was FDR who came and forced the British to break their alliance with Japan in order to try to weaken Japan. But then that ended up meaning that we definitely had to fight them in World War II. And if they'd stayed allies with the British all along, they might have been on the other side in that war if it had happened at all. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, a provocation along these lines. In fact, speaking of, well, let me go back, I guess. Don't let me forget MacArthur in Korea, because this is a new one to me, partially. But if you go back to the USS Maine, in the Spanish-American War, there was an accident in the coal room that spread to the ammunition magazine and an explosion that sort of half sank the ship in shallow water there off the coast of Cuba. And they pretended that that was a Spanish attack upon the American ship. And the slogan was remember the Maine. And this was their excuse then to seize Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines, and then leading to a war against the Filipinos who would resist us that led to the killing of between 300,000 and 500,000 of them and the taking of the Philippines to be an American imperial possession at that time, which again was another part of helping set the stage in the lead up to World War II and expanding American dominance in the Pacific and turning it supposedly into, quote, an American lake and all of that, and then having to treat the Japanese as a threat to America when in fact they were just a threat to American dominance in the Pacific, which is an entirely separate question. But so, and then you mentioned there in World War I, the Lusitania, and now the Zimmerman telegram, the Lusitania didn't work. It was 2 years later, a year and a half later, so that the Zimmerman telegram came out. And this was used as the excuse to finally get the declaration of war. And the thing is completely ridiculous. I mean, here you have the Kaiser's army is completely bottled up in the middle of Europe. It's not going anywhere. He's got no real naval power whatsoever. The British rule the seas. And the Zimmerman telegram was basically the Germans jerking the Mexicans around, more or less, saying, hey, if you guys will help us, then later on we'll help you reinvade and reconquer the American Southwest, which is just, just like Saddam Hussein's Manhattan Project. I mean, this is the height of ridiculous, fantasy. This couldn't possibly come true in a million years. And yet this was the provocation. And I guess the telegram was actually legitimate. It just amounted to nothing. And they exploited it like it was the real deal. And then, of course, there's Pearl Harbor, as you've covered, and it's Robert Stinnett who's done the best work on breaking that wide open, of course, in Day of Deceit that you have there. There's also the Pearl Harbor myth by George. And then
George Morgenstein.
No, it's Victor.
Well,
George.
Yeah. The other one is Infamy by John Toland. I haven't even finished that one.
Right.
It's incredible.
That was. In fact, John T. Flynn right away. Toland and Flynn had this stuff coming out within years. I think Flynn right away had the Pearl Harbor myth. A former writer for The Nation, a classical liberal writer for The Nation. And then so Korea. In fact, there were. And I think Justin Raimondo has done a good job of writing about this at antiwar.com. The South Koreans were waging provocations, and never mind the whole setup of how Korea got divided after the war and everything. That's too much. But in the actual events at the breakout of the war, the South Koreans were waging provocations across the border before the North Koreans invaded in the first place. And then secondly, after and I just got a great interview with Peter Lee Chinahand about this. He's got this documentary that he put out, and the untold story that when Truman fired MacArthur, it wasn't just that he was, somewhat out of line and was writing open letters to the Congress trashing Truman for, his reticence to get into war with China and all this and that. But he actually attempted to stage a provocation. And he sailed a whole task force down in the Taiwan Straits between Taiwan and mainland China. And he had this one ship, the John Bull, go within the 3-mile designation in the seas outside off the shores of China in an attempt to provoke them into firing the first shot again. And MacArthur already had permission from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that if you were fired upon, you can go ahead and take out whatever you want up and down the Chinese coast. And Truman fired him in the middle of this that day, in the middle. And if you go back and listen to my interview with Peter Lee, it's on the site. It's just a couple weeks ago. And he talks about how, it was actually because of communist spies in Britain in the Cambridge cell who had the information by way of the British, because MacArthur, I guess, had asked the British if they wanted to join us in this provocation. And the Cambridge spy Reds found out and told the Soviets, and the Soviets told the Chinese. And so then the Chinese made the very wise decision to let them provoke all they want. We're not going to fall for it, when they understood what the game was there. And it was in the middle of that Truman let MacArthur go publicly and had him replaced. And he was replaced by the end of the day. They finished their same mission under a different commander. So that was a huge one. And then, of course, Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. There was an original incident, but it was a retaliation against American frogmen special forces raids into North Vietnam. And there was an attack which was unsuccessful on the first day. And then the second day, there was no attack at all. And in fact, it was an honest mistake. It was the brand new guy on the sonar who mistook the Maddox, the USS Maddox's own propellers for incoming torpedoes. And after they dodged about 15 of these things, somebody said, go wake up the other sonar man and figure out what the hell is going on around here. And they realized that, it was a mistake. There never was a torpedo attack at all. And you can know all about this. You can learn all about this in chapter 1, and it's online too. In fact, it's on my website. Chapter 1 of Daniel Ellsberg's book, Secrets. a memoir of Vietnam in the Pentagon Papers. And it was actually his first day on the job as Deputy Secretary of Defense for, Undersecretary of something or other there. And it was his first day in the office of the Secretary of Defense, in McNamara's office. And he was there reading along with the teletypes as they came over. And they knew that afternoon that, oops, sorry, it was all a mistake. Never mind. Cancel that. False alarm. And then the next day, LBJ came out and said, them North Vietnamese attacked us, and I need the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to punish this aggression, which, if it had existed, would have been self-defense. But anyway. And then, I guess it depends on how much you want to, break down the false accusations against Grenada, the false accusations against Panama, that they were, a threat, that Noriega was an aggressive threat to American forces there that were stationed inside his country and all of this, when really, the CIA was just mad because he was double dealing behind their back and that kind of thing. And then there's, we talked about the false setup and the excuse for Iraq War I, where America baited them into it and then made up all these lies about how they were going to move on Saudi Arabia next if we didn't stop them and all this to launch Iraq War I. And then there was the pretended weapons of mass destruction threat all through the 1990s and into the 21st century that ended up being the excuse for Iraq War 1.5 under Clinton and Iraq War II under Bush Sr. And then we saw the pretended impending massacre in Libya, where Gaddafi supposedly had promised that he was going to massacre every man, woman, and child in Benghazi as soon as he got his hands on them, which is a complete lie. He never said that. He obviously never meant that. The military and the CIA knew that was a lie and didn't believe it and tried to negotiate an end of the war. He'd only sent 2,000 men to Benghazi. He didn't even have a military. He was afraid to have a military. They'd overthrow him. He only had this small little personal Gestapo force that had no ability to do anything other than fight small groups of rebels at a time, because there were very few of them for America to even back. And it was just an absolute lie that this was going to happen, and that America then had to protect the population of Libya from Gaddafi's aggression in that civil war. It was just absolute nonsense. It wasn't even a civil war until the Americans took it over, and then that makes it not a civil war either. But the rebels had no chance whatsoever. They were going to be done in a week or two. It was a very small group of them. And again, they were Al-Qaeda and Iraq veterans, most of them. And so that was a lie. And then they've been lying about Assad all along, that he's on the side of his enemies in the Islamic State, that he's the one who created them in the first place, that the whole war is launched because Assad just loves killing civilians. And so that's all he does all day is kill civilians. So it's America and the civilians against Assad, the evil genocidal killer, when it's just not true. And in fact, a plurality, if not a majority, of Sunni Arab Syrians support the government in Damascus and have. Not that they love Assad or approve of all of his tactics or whatever, but they're not a bunch of jihadists. And all that's on the other side is a bunch of jihadists. They've been lying about that all along, pretending it's just a bunch of moderates. And you have a couple of false flags even within the Syrian war, where you have Turkey and Al-Qaeda launch these sarin attacks, or so-called sarin attacks, and try to blame it on the Assad government in order to provoke an American escalation. And you still have this. Even to this day, after the Islamic State has been more or less defeated, now you have America again saying, no, we're not there for ISIS. We're there for Iran. Tillerson said, we're there because we have to, for whatever reason, see to it that somehow, one way or another, there's a regime change, and Assad must go, and Iran and Hezbollah's power in Syria must be limited. And they're not even making up a fake attack to justify it, right? They're just doing it. At this point, Americans hardly care either way, I guess,
I got two more questions for you. What are some of the biggest American war crimes that that people need to know about?
On like the individual level, well, there's an entire torture program. Aggressive war is a war crime itself. And so, but America backs the Saudi war in Yemen, which is a war against a civilian population there. America smashed and continued to wage semi-covert war against the people of Somalia since 2001, killing hundreds and hundreds of thousands, or leading to the deaths, I should say, of hundreds of thousands of people in the various droughts that have taken place in the midst of all this warfare, and completely destroyed it. They spread the jihad from Libya all down into Mali, and into Niger and Chad, Burkina Faso, and even Nigeria, where Boko Haram was already bad, but now they're friends with the Libyan jihadists they met in Mali. And so they've incorporated new teachings and tactics and weapons into, making them worse there. And the whole terror war itself is one big war crime. Again, exploiting a war against, look at the parallel, right? With Pearl Harbor. Talk about Pearl Harbor and George Bush. Someone pointed this out recently. Forgot who. George Bush wrote in his diary that the Pearl Harbor of the 21st century happened today. Oh, I know what it was. It was somebody wrote a really cool cartoon all about this. And it was actually something that was based off of a writing by Chris Hedges. And it was about how the Americans spent the 1990s celebrating World War II, the greatest generation, Iwo Jima, Saving Private Ryan, the Band of Brothers, and all of this stuff about World War II. And we Americans were just lost. We don't know what to believe in anymore. We need something for our civic religion to unite us, something to believe in, something great that we could do. And then we're attacked on September 11th and 3,000 are killed, just like at Pearl Harbor. It's this massive thing. And yet, Imperial Japan existed. Imperial Japan was a thing. It had a navy. It had an air force. They dominated Korea. They dominated Manchuria. They very soon came to dominate Singapore and the Philippines and all through, Vietnam and Indochina and all of this. And they were a world power. Al-Qaeda was not a world power. Hell, the Taliban didn't even control the whole country of Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda was 400 men. Al-Qaeda was a few Saudis and Egyptians, and that's it. So yeah, they got away with a hell of a thing, but there was no Islamo-fascist caliphate to attack. But this fit into American narratives, and now we have something great to do. Come on, guys, we're going to spread democracy. We'll call it whatever we want. And of course, there's so many wide and varied interests in here. Again, I'm not saying it was all benevolent motives and whatever. You got arms salesmen, you got the ambitions of the generals and the spies and the politicians themselves. And you have basically an incentive structure that says, believe in this and believe in it loud. And you have nothing saying otherwise, right? And if you don't believe in this and believe in it loud, then, you're some kind of commie or you're some kind of Hollywood actress or what the hell do you know? And in fact, this has always kind of bothered me that, it's a real bother that in the run up to Iraq War II, they did have anti-war voices, but they would only let actors come on. They would almost never would they interview somebody like Scott Ritter, who's a 6.5 foot tall Marine and former a captain in the Marine Corps and weapons inspector, and his every statement is an absolute authoritative statement of fact that no one can contest. That man in an anti-war sense can figuratively whoop the ass of all of the best warmongers you got all in one sitting. No problem. They wouldn't have him on. Instead, what they do, they'd bring on the actor that played BJ Honeycutt on MASH. And he would get up there and go, well, I don't know why we can't give the inspectors more time and stuff like that. And so you're led to believe that this is really the best anti-war voice in America. Is a guy who never went to Korea, a guy who he pretended he was in Korea when he was in North Hollywood. In fact, the first day I moved to LA, I was like, oh, it's North Korea from MASH. You see the hills right there. That's where they filmed this, was right here in North Hollywood, So what does BJ Honeycutt know about the war? That's what you're thinking when you're watching and you're saying, apparently they can't find any experts to oppose the war. The only people who oppose it are a bunch of pansy Democrats from the left coast who would be no good in a fight anyway. Apparently the rest of the consensus in the society against all tough guys is we know we have to do this. And BJ Honeycutt's feelings be damned. And that was the frame. It's just like when they used Alan Colmes to be the sidekick for Sean Hannity. Here's the most milquetoast, mealy-mouthed wimp for Hannity to just beat up on and beat up on and beat up on. Well, geez, guys, I don't know if we have all the information yet. You're a traitor. You would leave us open to terrorist attack. And Alan Colmes is no match for that. He was the perfect straw man for Fox News to use to beat up for 12 years. And meanwhile, Everything that the Warhawks said was wrong. Everything. And everything they promoted led to nothing but an absolute disaster that whole time. There's been no accountability for any of that. You know, the level of certainty is directly proportional to the degree to which they were wrong about everything.
Was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki justified?
Nah, of course not. I mean, the whole thing is a ridiculous joke. I mean, if you want to take care of it quick, you look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki by Ralph Rako, where he documents the various Japanese attempts to surrender to the United States before then. And of course, the entire argument always begins with the almost universally unquestioned premise that unconditional surrender was a perfectly acceptable position for the Americans to be taking at the time. And the Japanese were willing to surrender with one condition, that they get to keep their emperor. And the Americans said, no, you don't. That's not good enough. Unconditional surrender. And then, of course, MacArthur let them keep their emperor anyway. And then there's a substantial amount of scholarship demonstrating that the Truman administration discussed that this was a demonstration for Joseph Stalin, that here's what we can do for you as we turn on our ally from the war and get set to create the Cold War. And so it was a demonstration at the expense of the Japanese. And for God's sake, they're bombing. Look, they bombed 2 cities that were basically untouched by the war up until then because they were worthless as military targets. There was a slight bit of industry on the outskirts of Nagasaki, but that stuff wasn't destroyed in the strike anyway. It was on the outskirts of town. They bombed the center of town. Killed 200,000 people immediately, and another 100,000 or more died of the radiation poisoning and all that afterwards. This is a real litmus test, I think, not just, I don't know exactly how to phrase it, but when they bring this question to you as a kid in government school, the deal is, that's true. America's the only one who ever used nuclear weapons in war against people. But get this, the guy that did it, his name was Truman. And he was the hero, and he was trying to do everything he could to end the war, the most terrible war that ever happened. And so you got to be willing to think past that and go, well, wait a minute. Maybe Truman was the scum of the earth. Maybe what he did wasn't justified at all. In fact, if you listen to him, there's a quote where he says, well, they asked me why we didn't drop 3. And it's because I thought, man, all those women and children. Aha. So he admits he's a butcher of women and children, and he did this. And as Ralph Rako says in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he says, imagine if the argument was, yes, our GIs went in, marched in to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, rounded up all the men, women, and children in the center of town and machine gunned them all to death like the Gestapo. Would that be okay to end the war? To machine gun to death a bunch of men, women, and children in the name of protecting the lives of American GIs, which after all, it's true, they're conscripts, but still, that's not a fair trade. And the American people would say no to that. No, it's not okay to round up all the men, women, and children in the middle of town and machine gun them to death. But somehow dropping an A-bomb on them is good enough? It's wrong. And I mean, come on. It's a fake excuse. They could have ended that war without nukes. Simple as that.
Ralph Rako has a great book, Great Wars and Great Leaders, A Libertarian Rebuttal. He gives the sort of thought experiment. He goes, imagine a picture, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Adolf Hitler smiling together and saying cheers with, champagne in their hand or something. Well, that is the picture that does exist, but not with Hitler, with a more evil murderer as far as numbers go, Joseph Stalin. Ralph Rako has been huge in my libertarian understanding of history. So the last question I want to ask you, I'm quoting from page 405 of David Rockefeller's memoirs, chapter called Populist Paranoia. For more than a century, ideological extremists at each end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents, such as my encounters with Castro to attack the Rockefeller family, for influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family as internationalists and conspiring with others around the world to bring a more integrated global political and economic structure, one world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I'm proud of it. Page 405. You connected Rockefeller to Kissinger through Nelson Rockefeller. Is this a genuine plan we should be afraid of? And is the war on terror a mechanism to justify this plan?
Well, you're living in it. And I think, here's the difference between Murray Rothbard and the John Birchers, both of whom wrote quite a bit about, as Rothbard put it, Wall Street, banks, and American foreign policy. But the deal with Rothbard is he's no Bircher kook. First of all, he's not a right winger. And second of all, he's not a conspiracy nut. He's a serious scholar. And Rockefeller called it. Rothbard called it the Rockefeller World Empire. That was his name for America's empire. So the conspiracy theory stuff that he's talking about is the idea that, which is more the John Bircher thing, is that the Rockefellers' ultimate plan with the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission and building up the United Nations was to create a one world government at the expense of the United States, and that America would lose its independence. We'd lose our army. We'd lose our veto power on the UN, and there'd be a one world army and a one world federal government, and the U.S. Constitution would be destroyed and all of that. And that was where the Birchers are just barking up the wrong tree. They thought it was a global communist conspiracy, and they actually snapped out of it when they realized that communism does all their banking in New York City and in London. And that actually, as they considered it, it wasn't really the communist conspiracy. It was the capitalist conspiracy that was the granddaddy over the communist conspiracy as well. But then they went overboard with that, and they still couldn't ever seem to really wrap their head around their own discovery there. That Soviet communism is a useful enemy for the American empire. The goal was never to truly create a one world communist state, like in their conspiracy theories. It was to create a one world American state. We do have a one world army. It's the U.S. Army. And we do have a one world government. It's the United States government. And that is truly the legacy of the Rockefeller family, or certainly Nelson and David and that generation. Was to build up these international institutions as quite effective fig leaves for what is ultimately brutal American power. And this is how you keep liberal international. This is how you keep the entire political spectrum on board for empire. Is you dress up half of it as caring about people and implementing law and preventing war, when in fact it's really the opposite of that. And I really highly recommend that people read Wall Street, Banks, and American Foreign Policy by Murray Rothbard. Because when I read that, I was like, oh, wow, it's just like all my favorite John Birch conspiracy stuff, only without any of the wrong stuff, and really getting it right. And that's, no surprise, of course, it's Murray Rothbard.
Today's interview brought to you by Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan by Scott Horton. Scott, thank you so much for your time. Any final words? Well, I just have a couple final things. First of all, I need to have the option to opt out of paying for this absolute bullshit that is done in my name. We are not the government. I do not condone this. Scott doesn't. Thaddeus Russell doesn't. We're going out of our way as much as we can to stop such a thing from happening. The fact that wars are funded through violence, through taxation, that seems to go totally unnoticed by all historians and war experts and the CFR and Foreign Affairs magazine. We got to let people opt out. This is a great book, The Myth of National Defense by Hans Hermann Hoppe. You can find a interview with Scott Horton and Hans Hoppe regarding this subject. Scott, any final messages before we close out?
Well, I guess I've been disappointed a few times lately, and this has happened. I understand kind of that at the end of me saying lots of things, somebody says, well, you really know your stuff or something, as though that's my point. That like, well, I'm Mr. Know-it-all and I want you to respect me for being able to recite a bunch of facts or something like that. But that's not it. And people are supposed to pick up a lesson here that America's not supposed to be an empire. That what our government is doing with America's at least acquiescence, if not consent, is murder. It's wrong. And it's self-destructive to all of the rest of us, too. We have to stop it. We have to do something to stop it. And so, I mean, if I had to boil it down all the way, I guess it would be empire weakens America, the country. Just the more powerful our government is, the worse off the rest of this society is. And so I would hate for people to go, well, I guess for somebody who's like a total nut who just sits around reading this stuff all day, every day, then I guess you can recite a bunch of facts and this and that. But that's not the point. The point is the broader narrative that this is wrong and we got to do something to stop it.
For you neocons that agree regulation hampers private property and production, bombing the hell out of places is a bigger violation of private property rights than any domestic regulation that the FDA or the EPA could ever do. I mean, dear God, can these people think consistently? If the U.S. refuses to withdraw from Afghanistan, can Afghanistan nuke us twice? No, God damn it. That's the Japanese argument right there. Thinking consistently, sharing the evidence through books, through terrific books like this. Excellent arguments against or for the existence of blowback. Scott, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate everything you've done and continue to do.
Thank you, Keith. Really appreciate you having me, man.
In the early days of the internet, radical libertarians were scattered, lonely, and faceless. Without direction, they resigned to scour the web, sifting through content providers in a wasteland plagued by YouTube demonetization, Facebook jail, and covert internet censorship. But then, in 2017, the Libertarian Union was formed. Finally, the average Joe libertarian could find a thriving community of independent podcasters and content providers, all in one convenient location. At Libertarian Union, we'll always have the latest news, interviews, discussions, and even movie reviews. With hundreds of episodes and more added all the time, you'll always find something fresh at libertarianunion.com.